Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar for the SD card. My name is Jason Lettieri, and I'm sitting here with Anthony Nicolaitis as well. I'm going to be doing the presenting today, and Anthony is going to be here listening in and answering any questions that you may have. So at any point, if you have questions, just feel free to type them into the box, and we'll try our best to answer them as we do go along. Today we're going to be talking about all the different things that you can do with the SD card. We'll start off looking at the SD Card Suite, then we'll move into an SD card example Physiologic project file, and then also lastly we'll cover creating clone and project files with the SD card. So starting off, whenever you're using any application that encompasses an SD card, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you format the SD card with a Unitronics file folder structure. So to be able to do that, that tool is included with our SD Card Suite. The SD Card Suite can be found on our website. If you go to unitronics.com, the Support tab, and then Downloads. If you scroll down, you'll see the SD Card Suite. Currently, the most up-to-date version that we have is 2.0.38, but there's periodically updates and revisions as well, so you always want to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date version of the software. But once you have that free software downloaded and installed, if you open it up, you'll see I have it on my screen right now, the SD Card Suite. And the first option we're going to look at is the Tools. So if I click the Tools, it'll pop up here. And then you can see inside the Tools, the first option is the SD card formatter, which we're going to look at right now. When you pick the drop-down, you just have to make sure you select the SD card. It's important to note that before you put the PLC, the card inside the PLC, like I was saying, you have to make sure you format it on your computer first. So when you have the drop-down, you just have to pick which drive that the SD card is inside your computer. You can use a USB to SD adapter, or also there's sometimes built-in SD card readers. Those tend to not always work quite so well, so generally we would recommend that you use a USB to serial adapter instead of the built-in laptop card readers. But again, you could try the laptop card reader to see if it works. But no, you cannot format the SD card from inside the PLC. It is important to note that you do have to first format it with a PC, on your computer before you can use it inside of the PLC. Really what we're doing here is just putting, you'll see in a minute, a folder structure onto the SD card that the Unitronics PLC will be able to recognize. So the main thing to do is select your drive to format. In my case here, it happens to be I, but it will be whatever particular drive Windows assigns when you plug in your USB to SD adapter. So in my case, it's I. You want to make sure also that the card is formatted here in the file system with a FAT32 format. That's just a Windows type. There was FAT16, and now FAT32 is the main standard that we use. And here it's also going to show that we have a 2 GB, a 1.84 GB card. I'll just hit the start button. You'll see it's going to ask to confirm that we want to erase all the data that's on the SD card, and I'll hit OK. And then it just takes a minute or so. You'll see the progress bar goes across, and then once it's done, it'll open up the file to show you the completed formatting. And there it goes. SD card manager tells me, or SD card tools tells me that the drive has been formatted successfully. I can hit OK. And then it also popped up now showing the Unitronics folder structure that the PLC will be able to read. There's different folders for the alarms, the DTs is the data tables, also Excel and log files, trends, and we'll look at these more in detail in a few minutes. So I'll just close out of this right now. I should also say too that the SD cards that we support any brand SD card really. It's kind of an open standard. We do support SD cards ranging in size of a minimum of 1 GB card, so you need to make sure you use at least a 1 GB size SD card with our controllers, and theoretically we don't have a maximum for the largest size supported. I think generally on the market right now the largest you can find is about a 65 GB card. But there's really no theoretical limitation for the size of the maximum size card that we can support. It's really just limited by what you can actually get your hands on right now. But I mean, generally, most people would use either a 2 GB or a 4 GB card. We'll provide you with more than enough size for logging and recording information. Within the SD card tools as well, you can see there's a tab I'm going to click right now for SD card fill time calculator. Now this is a useful tool if you're maybe wondering how big of a card you actually need depending on your data size. This tool here will allow you to punch in some values. So let's say I'm recording on alarm history every 30 seconds. And I'm also using some data tables. When you define the data tables, you do have to specify the size. When you're if you've tuned into our webinars on the data table, you can see when you have the data tables, it defines a size for bytes that you're going to be using. So just as an example here, I'll put in byte size of 25, write option of overwrite, and let's say we're logging every 10 seconds. And we have another data table, which is 30 bytes. I'm overwriting, and interval is every 5 seconds. Let's also throw in some trends. Say we have 2 trends that are logging every 25 seconds. So with these options selected, you can see an SD card size of 2 gigabytes that I'm using right now will allow me to log for roughly 1,300 days. So it's quite a large amount of time that you can store, and there's the option here to drop down. If we did a 32 gigabyte card, you could log for 20,000 days. So the size that you can log and the capacity of the SD card is quite significant, so it gives you a large data logging option. The only other tool we have within this SD card tools option is the HTML compiler. We're not going to look at this so much right now. This is in regards to using the advanced web server, which we should have a webinar on relatively soon. But that's just another option to allow you to compile the file before you place it on the SD card when you're concerned with using the SD card Explorer, or enhanced web server rather. But in the tools here, the main thing that you need to do is just make sure that you format the SD card using the tools here and give it the proper folder structure. So I'll close out of this right now, and we will take a look at an example VisiLogic project file that's using the SD card demo. This program will be available with the recorded webinar as well, but I'll bring up my HMI screen right now so you can see what's going on in this program that I have downloaded to my controller on the desk right now. Let me open up remote access. So in this program right now, it really walks through the different types of logging that you can do with the SD card. The first option it shows right now, let me try to make this a little bit larger just so you can see it better too. Okay, that should be easier to see now. So in this SD card example program, the first option you can see right now, it has no SD card in it. So I'm going to pop my SD card in, which I just formatted with the SD card tools, and we should see the status change to SD is now in PLC. That's just a system bit that checks the status of whether or not the SD card is present. But as far as the different types of logging options, there are a few different ways you can do that with the SD card in Unitronics. First option you can see here is log line to SD. If I hit the button here, it'll show a log counter which starts counting. And log line basically allows you to grab a single line from your data table that you have already defined and place that row or that line of data into a special .ulg file. We'll look at how to open that up with the SD card tools later, but the first option you can do is the log line, which is a ULG file, and I'll hit the button to stop it right now. Next option, full data table to SD. If I hit that button, it will start logging, but this option here, it allows you to copy the entire data tables that you've predefined already in your VisiLogic project file and copy that entire data table to the SD card. So that it allows you to grab all that information and then essentially have a backup, if you will, on the SD card. And this type of file that it records it to is a UDT file. So we'll look at how to open that as well. I'll stop that option. Third option, append data table to SD. This is similar to the full data table to SD. It still uses a UDT file, but in here we're just essentially we're creating a different tag, so a subdivision of a data table. So instead of overwriting the entire one, we're creating different sections in this UDT file, so it separates it out and allows you to append, add on to the data table with separate sections instead of completely overwriting everything all at once. This will make a little bit more sense later on once we look at this file that we've created. But again, it's just a UDT file like the previous option. So I'll stop that guy. Last option is a CSV file. This CSV stands for comma separated value, and it's really a standard type of file. What's unique about this is that it allows you to write a file directly to the SD card, which can be opened up with Excel, for example. The other UDT that we just looked at and the ULG, the log, and the data table files, those can be exported to Excel later on, but you do have to use a Unitronics tool to be able to export those data tables and log files to other types of useful formats, for example, Microsoft Excel. But the CSV file that we're recording right now, that actually allows you to, I'm just going to stop this so it doesn't get too large. The CSV file allows you to be able to actually write a CSV file which is opened up directly into Excel. So it's very useful if you want to eliminate Unitronics tools, for example, as another software path in between. You can open up the CSV file directly into Excel. And if I hit next, we'll look at one more option here. This is the read data table tags from SD. So what we're doing right now is we're going to actually read a file that's been created on the SD card and write that to the Unitronics data table. The previous page was, gathering the information from our data tables or CSV and writing that to the SD card. Here, we're doing the opposite action. We're going to take the file that's been created on the SD card, and we're going to go ahead and write that back to the internal data tables of the PLC. So in here, if I enter in a tag number of 1 and hit read tag from SD, you'll see the message change to success, and that basically informed us that we just copied the file that was on the SD card and we wrote that to the internal data tables. So that's really the basics of the operation of this program. We'll take a look real quick at the code on how this actually operates. So within the main routine of this SD card program, we're really just in the main routine here, we are setting up our PLC name and also our SD password, which we've looked at before, and then we're really just generating sample data is the majority of what these nets are doing here. So nothing too relevant in the main routine, and we're just generating sample data to be written to the SD card for demonstration purposes. Within this project as well, we've defined 4 separate data tables. If I open those up, you can see the first one is dedicated to the ULG file, which is a simple line. So there's really only one row here since we are just doing the log file. The second table is in reference to the full data table copy. Log 3 is for our append. And let's take a look at the actual subroutines. This program is split up nicely in that each of the different types of data logging that we just walked through are actually in separate subroutines, so it makes it easier to go through and analyze each type of log. So right now I'm in the SD log 1, which pertains to the ULG file, the Unitronics log file. So the first thing that we're doing is in net 1 we're just writing sample data to our log 1 table, which is going to be used for the log file. So in net 2, again, system bit 13 here is just saying we're going to write data every 1 second. It's just a special system bit. And you can see here as well, there's a couple of bits which are relevant to the SD card, whether they're the SD card present, so we're making sure that the card is there before we write to it. We're checking to make sure that the card is write enabled. On most SD cards you'll see that there's a little switch that you can flip back and forth just to protect writing value. So we want to make sure that that switch is not engaged if we're going to write to the card. And then also system bit 340 here is a status bit to tell us that there's nothing in progress when we're trying to write to the card already. So the next block, which I have highlighted right now, is actually what's going to do the writing from the data table to the SD card in the ULG file format. So all of the SD card writing utilities can be found under the SD menu, and in this case the SD data table utilities is what we're using, and the first option is log data table row line to SD in a ULG file format. So that's the one that I have selected already in this program. I'll open it up so we can walk through. And in most of these blocks as well, there's a nice explanation of what's actually going on in the white parameter here. You can see it's copying the data from the row in the selected data table, and it's writing it to a file that's called unilog.ulg located on the SD card. So the main parameters that you do have to select are the data table project that you want to use. In this case, we're using log1, which we looked at before, is relevant to the log1 data table that we've predefined. So we're copying that log1 as our source, and then the other options we just have to select here are the row index. In this case, there's only one row. And then also the output are just status messages as well. So you can assign, random memory integers or memory bits here to check your status. If it's not writing for some example, for some reason, you could go back and check these status bits to help troubleshoot what's going on in your program. So we'll take a look at the second example, or the second subroutine for the different type of data. So the previous subroutine 1 was looking at the ULG file. Now we'll go ahead and look at the entire data table. So again, in net 1, we're just writing our row to the actual internal data tables at that preset interval. Net 3 is just generating a file name. We won't walk into these num to ASCII and string tools in this webinar, but just so you know, they can be found under the string menu. But essentially, net 3 is just giving a name to the file that we're going to write on the SD card. We didn't have to do that with the log file because the log file is always a preset to be named as unilog.ulg, so there's no real option to name a file with a previous log line. But when you're actually copying the data table, it does allow you to be able to give a custom name to that. So if we look at the actual function block in net 4, when I open that up here, again, there's a white description which goes through basically what the function block is going to be doing. But in this case here, we're copying the entire data table. So the first option is the source, the data table. In this case, we're copying log2. So data table number 2, log2, we're going to be using as our source. And you do have the option to only copy certain parts of the data table as well. If you want to specify a starting row, a number of rows, you can do that. But for demonstration purposes here, we're just going to be copying the entire data table. So the next parameter you want to make sure you define is a target. So we do have to say where on the SD card we want to save that data to. Again, with the log file, that automatically saves it in the log folder. There's not a whole lot of options. But with the full data table, you can see we can pick the 4 different subfolders that we want to save it in, or also the main root folder as well. So since we're doing a data table block, you can save it in any of these 4 folders that we have available. In this case, it's just saving it to folder 1 on the SD card. And again, you can give a name to the UDT file. It can be a constant value if you like. You could type it in, call it, test table. But as you can see here as well, the file name actually can be a maximum of 8 characters, so it can be the full words test table. But for example, 8 characters maximum is the name for the UDT file. But if I hit cancel, right now it's saved to an indirect value, a memory integer 530 in this case, which you can see is also the output of those string blocks that we just briefly went through. But the main thing here is that we're giving a file name. In this case, it happens to be an indirect name. Next options, if you can select whether you want it to overwrite or append. Here we're just going to be overwriting the entire data table. So we just click the little radio button for overwrite UDT file. The next thing we'll look at will actually use append, so we won't talk about that quite at this moment. Again, you just have status messages which you assign to unused memory integers and memory bits to help you troubleshoot your program. So subroutine number 3, again, you can see it looks almost identical to subroutine 2 because it really pretty much is. We're using the same function block, data table to SD, again found under SD menu, SD utilities, write data table to SD UDT file. So if we look at the block, again, you can see it's identical to the previous one. We just have our different source data selected. This time we're copying log 3, which is our data table 3, and we're going to be placing the file into, this time, data table number 2 folder. Again, this can be whatever folder in here you like, but in this instance we're just copying to DT2. Here as well you can see we're using a static file name. Before we had an indirect string to name files, but you can also have a constant value. App DT append data table, in this case it's just a constant file name. And this time as well we're appending to the UDT file. So instead of overwriting that table every single time, now we're going to be appending to that UDT file. So it's creating like a subdivision essentially in that UDT file. And you can also assign names to those subdivisions, which in this case is assigned to a tag name and indirect value. So before we look at the CSV, we'll hop to number 5. Number 5, in this case here, we're copying. You can see as the function block says, we're going to be reading the tag from the section of the UDT file, and then we're going to be placing that information that we just read back into the internal data tables of the PLC. So not quite too much to select here. It's very similar to the other blocks. You have to select the source folder on the SD card. So we're going to be taking our DT2 folder that we just wrote in subroutine 3. So we're going to be taking that file. The file name that we just saw was appdt. Again, we're reading from that particular file. And this time we're going to be writing the value, the target data table, to log 4. So essentially in here we're copying from the table the information that we have from the SD card, and we're placing it in the table that's called log 4 on the PLC. So this one is going the opposite direction, but it's relatively straightforward as well to set up. For the read options, again, you can have a numeric tag number or also a text tag. In this case, we just specified a text tag number to be able to read from. So I'll close out of here. And we'll go to our CSV subroutine. This one is set up just quite a little bit different than the other 3 options that we looked at, or 4 options, I guess. Instead of using the UDT file or the ULG, this time we're actually going to be writing to a CSV file, which is directly openable in Microsoft Excel, for example. So whenever you're writing a CSV file, there's two different function blocks that are required. First thing you need to do is prepare the data that you want to be able to write, and then the second function block actually writes that data. So again, these function blocks are found under SD Excel utilities, and the 2 that we have here are create the Excel delimited line, which is where we prepare the file, and then the write delimited line is where we actually write that file. So looking at net 1, we can see, similar to the other ones, we have our writing every 1 second. We're checking make sure the card is present, write enabled, and nothing is in progress already. So we'll open up the SD delimited line. Within here is where you actually specify the columns for the row that you're going to write. So each number 1, 2, 3, 4 here is going to be a cell in the row that you're defining. So in this case, we're going to be writing our date first, into the first cell, our time into the second cell, and then just 2 random numeric datas to our cells 3 and 4. So with each of these cells, you do have to define delimiter 1 and 2. So when you're writing your cells, you have to make sure you select delimiter as CSV and null for all of your cells except for the last one. So what we're saying, if you open it up, you can see you just select CSV, which is our comma, and then a null. So we're going to be writing a CSV number 2C, and then a null for all of our cells except for the last one. And the reason being, the last one that you have defined, in this case number 4, you can see the delimiters are carriage return and line feed. Basically, we're just telling it to wrap around down to the next row once we finish writing this first data. So each of your cells 1, 2, 3 in that line are going to have a CSV and a null as their delimiters. And then the important thing is that always your last data line, your last cell that you define, make sure you have a carriage return line feed as your delimiters. Excuse me. Now, the other parameters we have to define here are our start of buffer, essentially. So I said we had to prepare the file first in this delimited line block. So what we're doing, you can see I've assigned in this case MI560. So we're gathering up this information that we just defined in our source data, and we're storing that into a vector which is starting at 560. So we're preparing all of our cells of data, and we're writing that preparing that to a file location MI560 in this case. It's good to make sure you reserve enough memory integers that you'll have space where you won't overflow, but what's nice is that you can see in bold it tells you how many memory integers you're actually going to need for this amount of data. So for our 4 cells here, we're occupying MI560 through 568. For all those characters and all that data that we just prepared, it's going to be occupied in those 9 MIs there, 560 through 568. So really you just have to make sure you define a starting memory integer which has enough space where you're going to start preparing that data. In this case we did 560. The next option you can specify is the max length. Again, just make sure you have a maximum amount of bytes. And again, you can see too, under total size, it tells you how much each is going to occupy. So it really calculates everything out for you. There's not a whole lot that you have to take into consideration there because it does all the calculations for you. Just make sure you assign enough space for that, MI560 in this case. And then the output parameters, 589 and 588 in this case, they're really just more status messages. It tells you the final byte size and also any other statuses if you need to do some sort of troubleshooting. But the main thing here is prepare your cells with the relevant data. Here we use 4, and make sure that your last field, your last cell that you define has a carriage return line feed, and that data will all be stored starting in the output that you define, in this case 560. So I'll cancel out of here. Now, the second block, I said we have to prepare the data first, and then we have to actually write it. So the second block we have in series is the write delimited line. So you just have to make sure here, the source data, we're starting our source vector data at MI560, which we just specified in the previous block. So 560 is containing our cells that we just prepared. We're saying that's where they actually are. That's where we want to write from. So we're writing the information that we just prepared into MI560. That data is going to be written to the target SD card folder that we specify. Here you can see there's a special folder that was defined on the SD card for these type CSV Excel files. So here we're just writing it to Excel1. Again, you can write it to either the root folder for Excel or any of the 4 subfolders as well. So you have to specify the target folder and then also a file name for that CSV file. Here we just called it a static value of log4. It can also be an indirect value if you wish, but here it's going to be log4 as our static file name. And it's important to note as well that like any of the file naming conventions that you do on the SD card, they can all only have a maximum file name of 8 characters, and that really just follows the 8.3 file naming convention that's been well established. So the bottom line is that you just have to have a file name that you make sure is no longer than 8 characters following the 8.3 file convention. Besides the status bits here, the only other option you have is whether you want to write to a standard text file, but in most cases you want to write it to the CSV, the comma-separated value file so you can open it up directly into Excel. So that's really all the options that we've went through in this demo project for creating the 4 different types of files, whether it's the line, the actual data table, or an Excel file, a CSV. Those are the main I guess 3 types of files that you'd actually write to the SD card using Unitronics. So we'll take a look at those files. We just created them in our demo program before. We saw when we were remote access. But if I go back now to our SD card suite, we'll take a look at some of the other options. You can see we looked at tools when we first started, but there's also the SD card manager and the SD card explorer. First we'll look at the SD card explorer. So when we open this guy up, you can see the first thing mainly that we want to do is specify our settings. So in the settings here, you just have to make sure that you match these to be what you are communicating with normally in VisiLogic. So in my case, I have a USB serial adapter which talks on COM port number 3. So I'm going to hit, once you have the right COM port, right baud rate, the only other thing you have to make sure you specify is a PLC name. Generally that's not required when you're using VisiLogic. Just for talking communications, unless you're over Ethernet, but for serial it's not really required. But whenever you're using any of the SD card tools, you do have to make sure also you enter in the correct case-sensitive PLC name. It's kind of just an extra layer of security. But if you hit check, it'll confirm it sees that my PLC is there. I recognized it. I'll hit OK. So that's been saved. You can just hit open then. And now, SD Card Explorer, you can see in a second, it allows you to view the contents of the SD card as if you were actually had the card inside your computer. So right now, this SD card is still inside my PLC, and I'm accessing it over a serial adapter in this case. But again, you could do this over Ethernet as well. So essentially, it allows you to view the contents of the SD card inside the PLC from anywhere in the world without actually popping the SD card out of your controller. You can have remote access to the SD card that's inside the controller with the SD Card Explorer tool. So browse on the left here under Data Tables. Now we had written to our folders DT1, DT2. We didn't write to 3 or 4 in this case, but for example, now when I click DT1, you can see here I can view the UDT files that I've created. So if I open this up, I double click, it will allow me to view the contents of that UDT file. So this is viewing the live data that was on the SD card using the data table editor, which you also saw you could select from the main menu of the SD card suite. So when you double click it within SD Card Explorer, it opens up, and this is the information that we've written to the UDT file on the SD card that we're viewing inside the PLC right now. So I'll just close out of this here. If we want to take a look at DT2, this append DT file, you can see here it shows the different subdivisions in the tags. So we had created 3 different tags. So now we can view our tag 0, our appended tag 1, and also appended tag 2. So in the one we just opened, there was only a single table to select, but this file in the data table 2 folder is the one where we actually appended the data table to the SD card. So now you can see how there's the separate, I guess if you want to call them subdivisions within the table, within that UDT file that you can view and go through the different appended files in this case. So that's all that we really created in the UDT with the data tables. We'll look at the Excel. We had written to Excel number 1. I'll double click this and open it up. Now this should open me up right into Excel. And we can see the information that we had written here. I'm not quite sure why we have the invalid data there, but you can see it opens it up right into Excel. So you can access that and save that from the SD card. So the other type of file that we created was the log file, which is placed in the log folder. It was called unilog.ulg. Now you'll notice that this type of file, the associated extension is that default Windows picture, basically meaning it doesn't know how to open it. So what I wanted to point out was that within the SD Card Explorer, you have full access to be able to open up the UDT file and also the CSV, the Excel file. But from SD Card Explorer, you cannot open up the ULG file. Also, you cannot open up the trends file and the alarms. So those three types of files, the Unilog, the trends, and the alarms history, cannot be opened up from SD Card Explorer quite so easily like you can with the UDT and the CSV. So we do have another tool actually that allows you to open up the log files and the trend files and the alarm files. Those type of files will be opened up with SD Card Manager, which we'll look at in a minute. So what if you have the card in your PLC and you want to be able to actually open up the log files or the alarms or trends, but you can't go out and take that file, you can't take that card physically out of the PLC? What we have is an option to be able to download or back up all the SD files and folders into the local drive. So if I click this download button here, you can specify where you want to save it to on your local computer. So when you hit OK here, it will go out, it'll copy all those folder contents from the SD card and place them onto your local desktop. So you'll have all those files backed up on your local computer, and then you can open them up with the SD Card Manager. I already did that earlier. I'm not going to do it right now because it does take a little bit more time if you have large files on here. But we'll take a look at that. Other options, you can just refresh. If you have new data and you hit refresh, it will refresh what you have and what you can see. Also, you can write files to the SD card, and you can also, if you select a specific file, instead of downloading them all with this black option, you can download specific files with the blue down button, or write to it with the up button, as well as delete and paste as well. So those are the main options that you have in SD Card Explorer. Main things to take from that is that you can open up the UDT file and CSV files directly within SD Card Explorer. If you want to open up the log file, trends, or alarms, you have to make sure that you back up all the files and folders to a local drive first, and then use SD Card Manager instead, which we'll look at right now. So I'm going to close this connection, and I also have SD Card Manager open already. So from within SD Card Manager, first thing you want to do is create a new project. So you have to specify, the location you want it and what you want to call it. So I'll just call it webinar. Hit OK. So now I have a new project open in my SD Card Manager. First thing you want to do is import an SD folder. I mentioned that you can't go on live mode like you can in SD Card Explorer with SD Card Manager. You do have to have the folder backed up locally on your computer first, or you can also have it plugged into the USB port as well. So if you have it and you can't get it out of the PLC physically, you can use SD Card Explorer like we just saw to grab that file and download it locally to your computer. Or if you wish as well, you have the option to, you can physically pop the card out of the controller and then import that as well. So here I'm just going to pick Import Local Folder because I already have it saved on my desktop. Source folder, I had just called it SD card, and you can see when I browse down to SD card, which I had saved earlier, it shows all the 8 folders that I have here with the different files. I'll hit OK. You can give the target folder an alias if you'd like. It's really just going to be named within an SD Card Manager here. If you don't give it a name, it will just give it a default timestamp, but I'll call it webinar SD in this case. Hit next. Now it shows you it's gone through, it's imported the folders, and it's saved it within my project file here. So X out, hit finish. Now you can see the alias name that I had given, webinar SD, and you'll notice here it only opens up the relevant folders that have files in them that can be read. We haven't used, for example, the web server folder or the user app folder, system folder. So it really just opens up the ones that pertain to relevant files that can be opened. So we noticed before we looked at the data tables. You can also look at the data tables within SD Card Manager, but it's kind of a two-step process. So if you're just looking at the UDTs, it's really easier to just use the data table editor or the SD Card Explorer. But what I really wanted to show you was the log file. Now, we had opened up this log, we had created the log file in the demo earlier, but we weren't able to open it in SD Card Explorer. In SD Card Manager, you can see now we can open up this ULG file. It renames it as a USD to be able to open it up in the manager, but it is the original .ulg log file that we had created earlier, taking our logs from our logged lines from the data table and placing it in that ULG log file. You have the option to export it to a CSV or export it to Excel, so you can use it in any other sort of major database software. You can export that file. We didn't look at this so much today, but I have from a previous project. If you tuned into our webinar on alarms, we had a project where if you held the door open or if you had turned the temperature too high, too low, it set off alarms in a different application, not relevant to the one we did today, but in a previous webinar we had looked at alarms, and the alarms creates an alarm history. It's a UAL file. And you can open up that UAL file within SD Card Manager. That UAL file is saved on the SD card, hence why we can open it in the SD Card Manager. And again, you can export to Excel or CSV if you like. And also, I don't believe we've gone over trends yet in any of our webinar series, but if you're familiar with them, the trends are just a graphical representation of data that's available in our enhanced series controllers. And you can view the trends live in your actual PLC program. Again, this is taken from a separate application, nothing relevant to today, but a separate application. But with the SD trends, you can copy the trends that you have live in the RAM on the controller. You can copy them and back them up to the SD card. And if you back them up to the SD card, you can view them in SD Card Manager here. And you can also export those to Excel as well. So you can have your graphs and your data points exported from the SD card. If you write the trends to the SD card, you can open them up here and view them as well, export them. So those are the main features of SD Card Manager. We looked at SD Card Explorer, our sample project, and our tools. So that's the majority of the SD Card Suite. And again, this is where I pulled up SD Card Manager, Explorer, our data table editor, and also our tools for formatting. There is one more thing I wanted to cover. I believe we have enough time. We'll look at one other powerful option of the SD card. We've just looked at the data logging options that we have, but with the SD card you also have the option to create clone files or application files, and what these allow you to do is you can create a project file and you can just send in the mail your customer an SD card so they can have their controller that's out in the field. They can take that SD card, go out into the field, pop it into the controller, and update their program or download the application initially. Anything you want, really. But what's powerful is that it allows you to download a Visiologic project file to the controller without using a computer at all. All you need to do is insert the SD card into the PLC, and you can update a project on the controller without using a PC at all. It just installs it directly from the SD card. So there's 3 different ways that you can do that. The original method that you would be able to do that is from information mode. I can't show you that on remote access. Information mode isn't supported in online test mode here, but I could just tell you if you go into information mode, you enter your default password on your PLC. To get into information mode, you hold down the touchscreen for 4 seconds. It'll ask you for a password. The default is 1111. And then you'll see there's a SD menu that you have options available for, and there you can select to clone and download it to the SD card or upload it to the PLC. So that's one option which is built into every controller, is information mode, which allows you to create and create and download the clone file directly from information mode. Another option which was recently added is the ability to do that from the ladder code. So if you want to, when you're initially creating your project, if you want to program in a special HMI section, like a settings or a maintenance menu, for example, in your software, a separate HMI that's dedicated to the cloning, you can program that in. And we'll see under the SD menu, it's just the clone option. So you have the options to clone to the SD card or from the SD card, whether you want to create the clone file or actually download the project, the clone file, to the controller. You would just select that. Also, whether you're just doing the data tables, just the firmware, full cloning, operands. So we won't go through this right now in detail, but that is an option to be able to select the clone file either from information mode. More recently, you can add it from the ladder, program in your application to have a nicely designed HMI section, and use the clone from the ladder tools. And another easier option, which I can actually show you, is under the project menu, and then create project files. This allows you to create the clone or the application files directly from VisiLogic. So you have your project open, your VLP, you can create the clone file directly from VisiLogic. Now, I have been mentioning a clone file or an application file. There's two main different ones that you'd want to use. It shows you here if you read the screen, but the clone file, it's a .c57 or .c350, C130, depending on which controller you have. But the main difference is that the clone file, it actually includes the firmware, so you can include the latest operating system in that clone file. Also, data table values. If you create it from the controller in information mode, you can copy all the operand values, so the current status of the operands in your controllers. You can copy those current status of the operands, and those will also be transferred to the secondary PLC that you install it in. So mainly the clone file just includes the extra options, data tables, flash operating system, and also operand values if you have those as well. And those are created in the .c57, for example, file. The other option you have is solely a project file. And when you make just the project file, its extension is a .v57 or .v35, and that really just includes the VisiLogic project file. So that would be essentially if you were just doing under the connection menu and a standard download. If you use a project file only, it would just be doing a standard download, no other firmware or data tables operands included. So the clone gives you a little bit more flexibility, but if you just want to download a standard project file, just the application, then you'd want to use the v57 file. Now, if you create either of these files from information mode, it automatically places these files that you create in the correct folder. If you do it from VisiLogic here, you're going to create the file. You can see here, I'll make a VisiLogic project file, I hit create. It's going to ask where I want to save it. I'll just put it on my desktop. Again, make sure you don't give it a file name that's longer than 8 characters. I call this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 just to be safe. Save it. It's going to go through, it's going to build and compile your application. And then it doesn't actually tell you when it's done, but it has just created the file, or I guess it closes out to tell you that it's done. But now, if I go to my desktop, you can see I've created this .v57 file now. So we'll go back to VisiLogic. But the .v57 file, that is placed in a separate file location than the clone files. So when you create the files manually from VisiLogic here, you have to make sure you go, and when you're using a clone file, that has to be placed in the system folder. So if you create a clone file from VisiLogic, make sure you copy and paste that .c57 file that you just created and place that in the system folder. If you are creating a project file, as we just did, the .v57 for example, that type of file extension needs to be placed in the user app folder. So the .v extension goes into the user app, and the .c extension goes into the system folder. And again, if you create the files from VisiLogic, you place them on the SD card, your customer can go take that SD card out into the field, and then if you haven't pre-programmed a section of your HMI, they can always just go into information mode and be able to to retain that file that you just created on the SD card. So again, you can do it from VisiLogic here. You can also do it from information mode of the controller. You can create the clone file as well from information mode of the controller, not just read it back. But one other thing I guess I forgot to mention is when you're creating the clone file from VisiLogic, or I'm sorry, if you're creating the clone file from information mode, you do have to make sure that you include an SD password in some point in your application. So that's just found under the SD menu and set password. So what this is saying is if you want to be able to pull the information off your controller and write it to a clone file on the SD card out in the field, you have to essentially enter in a password that you've defined before it lets you pull the information off of the controller. And really what this is doing is just an additional layer of security so that not just anyone can walk up with an SD card, clone your project, and then take it back and install it in a different PLC. So the password really just adds a second layer of security, and it is a requirement. You can't leave it out. If you try to upload a project that doesn't have an SD password included, you'll get a little red error message from information mode that tells you password's missing. So that is one requirement, to make sure that you include an SD password. It's probably not a bad idea just to put it in any project, just so you know, but mainly its use is if you want to be able to clone the project from the controller from information mode. You do have to include an SD password if you want to be able to go ahead and do that. And that's really all the information that I have to go through today. It's been about an hour or so. Yeah, one other function block that we do have as well. There's a function block to SD safely remove. So when you create this function block, you define a double word register for a status, and then also a bit. So you can monitor this bit to make sure that it's safe to remove the SD card before you pop it out. So that's another good thing to include in your project, is to just make sure you can make sure you don't lose any data. Essentially, make sure that it's safe to remove it before you eject it from the PLC. But like I said, that's all the information that I have right now to present to you. So I'd like to thank you for attending. I will leave the webinar open here, so if you have any other questions, you can keep typing them away, and we'll be here and answering them. But that's really it for the presentation right now. I should also mention too that we've been trying to put these webinars together in a series, and they're all going to be recorded as well. So they are available right now. If you go to our website and then the support tab, and then you can click the webinars, and you'll be able to view the recording and also all the project files associated. And we also have them in a separate section of our website as well. If you go to our forum, forum.unitronics.com, you will also see that we have the webinars on there as well. I'll try to go there, but my computer's being a little bogged down right now. Or we can just take you to, I'll show you both places. If you go to our support tab, the webinars are also under webinars here. You can see, I guess we only have 3 up here in this section. But under the support tab and then forum, this will bring you to our newly launched forum from the summer. And usually you'll see them pop up as the first thing. We've been having them as the featured webinars, a featured section of the forum. But if you go to blogs on the top here, you can see, again, all the blogs will be listed, and they're being posted as blogs right now. If you go to webinars collection, that's where it'll show you everything that we have posted as far as the webinar series. And I'll just click one here. You can see this is where it opens up with the recorded videos that we have. So all these webinars have been recorded. They're being hosted on YouTube right now. And you can see my internet's a little slow, so it's taking a second or so to load it. But they're separated into easy chunks to digest, usually about 5 or so videos. Question and answers are posted, as well as the attached files. So again, the file that we did today, that SD card demo, will also be posted on here as well, so you can go back and reference that if you want to go over it in more detail. But other than that, I'd like to thank you for attending. And also, if you have any suggestions for future topics or comments on what we did today, comments on webinars in general, you can always feel free to send those suggestions or comments to support@unitronics.com, and we'll be reading that there, so we can have a little bit of feedback. It would be appreciated, so we know what to cover, more topics in the future, and if we should be doing anything differently to better help you. But otherwise, thank you and goodbye.